Welcome to the Bitcoin Unlimited podcast. I'm John Moriarty, and today I'm joined by Josh Green, lead developer at Bitcoin Verde and a driving force behind formalizing a specification for the Bitcoin Cash network. Josh, thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, John.
So, to bring everyone up to speed, could you describe what a specification is exactly?
Yeah, sure. So there's kind of like two mentalities for what a specification could be, right? It could be something that is proscriptive, or it could be something that is descriptive. And by that, it's basically like, do we want to be describing what the protocol does, or should we really be telling people what the protocol does? And I think we've kind of decided to do the former. So we're trying to describe what the protocol does, because ultimately, it's a free world and people can do what they want and they don't have to follow the rules. And if they want to form a new consensus, they can. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're describing how the nodes talk to one another, how transactions are validated, really what's happening at a technology level for Bitcoin Cash.
And so, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each one? Now, you said obviously right now we sort of it's a free world. So, in what situations might the other approach be valid or worthwhile?
I think if the alternative to like a descriptive, you're saying like a proscriptive.
Sure.
So like an advantage could be, I mean, if everyone always wanted to do what they were told, right? I guess we could then always make sure that everyone's on the same page. But then we're kind of like in the same world that BTC is in, right? Where there's only one reference client, and what they do like is the protocol, right? Kind of like it's basically like pretending like there's only one node implementation, and they get to dictate what happens. And that's why we didn't want the specification to turn into that. We want to still embrace the concept that there are multiple nodes. We want to collaborate. We want to make sure that we're able to talk to one another. But in the same sense, like if they want to make something work differently, they're going to and they're allowed to. So we just want to document how they're behaving differently, instead of trying to like beat them over their head with like with a hammer that doesn't actually work. So that's what we're trying to do.
That makes sense. And I guess maybe it's the case that that's only an appropriate approach in, say, a centralized environment where you're dealing with something that you actually have control over.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like the reality is the project that we're working on for the specification doesn't have any authority, and we're not going to pretend like it does. Like we can write all sorts of things saying that you must do this and you must do that, but the reality is like, the nodes are the ones that really kind of, and the miners really decide, and also the users. They decide what the protocol really is by using it and by supporting it and by implementing it. It's not a piece of paper that really just forces people to do things. So we're not pretending to be an authority. We're just trying to describe things so that new developers and even old developers don't have to go through the source code to actually figure out what's going on. They can actually just digest what's going on in a way that is human readable, and it also helps to emphasize how upgrades should go in the future. Like historically, when we've been looking at upgrades, and this Bitcoin Cash has been getting a lot better about this, but historically in Bitcoin, when we would do a BIP, like an upgrade, like the BIP was basically defined by the source code. So like there was a few times in some of the BIPs where it's like, and just reference what this flag means in C++, and then you'll understand like what the protocol, like what the change in the protocol is. And like that's not really a great way to communicate to the other node developers like what the behavior should be. So having kind of like the specification or documentation kind of incentivizes people to put into words that are not specifically tied to your node or even the language of your node, so that other people can get on the same page, because not everyone's using C++, not everyone's using Java, etc. Like there needs to be a human understandable way to describe what these upgrades should do.
That seems to bring up an interesting point, which is that this approach that the code is the spec. Not only is it not necessarily very accessible because you have to read the code, but it it also limits its applicability to the programming language in which the original code was written, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and we've had issues like that come up in the past, like just based on like natively what the code does, either being obscure because of like the nuances of C++, or or um, or even just not being really well understood because code can be complicated, especially node code. It's not always linear. It's not like you could be like, okay, well, I'm going to go to where the transactions are validated and I'm going to know every single rule that exists. It's like, no, that's not really how it works. Like, there's bits and pieces of it all over the place, and it's complicated, and it's easy to misunderstand. And also like there's what's the I think it's murmur hash. I think it's murmur hash. We have an implementation of murmur hash, and it basically, like, depending on like the actually, murmur hash isn't a good example. A really good example is back when we were relying on the DER encoding for signatures, and like basically the OpenSSL implementation, which was like a library that I think is/was being used by the reference, like the BTC reference client, was very permissive for how it parsed signatures, and the formatting that was there. So like basically the specification was determined by a third party library on whether or not they would accept it. And like that's not really great. Like it makes sense because at the time, like back in, like Satoshi days, like, everyone's using that client. And if not, at a minimum they're using the OpenSSL library. Like it's a very common library. And, parsing a DER like signature is, as long as it works, that's the intent is at hand. But like if you were to technically like manually push a signature that had like one of the more obscure like edge cases for signatures, it would still be accepted, but like it would be kind of like weird why it was. And then if you weren't using OpenSSL, it wouldn't validate. Um, so yeah, that like depending, like the code is the spec is like not wrong, but it is wrong. It's setting yourself up for failure real fast.
And I mean, you said just quickly there that it wouldn't validate. What exactly are the potential repercussions of the spec not being clear and then ending up with differences?
Yeah, you would. I mean, like you would just have a fork. Like it's happened before. Uh, like earlier days. I think I forget why, but there was actually like a rollback. Like they've actually, BTC has actually been rolled back before, but I mean, like what you can do depending on like the ramifications of the differences is either one fork becomes orphaned, because it wasn't an intentional split, right? Like I guess in the case of like the signature parsing, like if if uh, if we didn't want to honor the like weird ways that you can encode a signature, then then that fork can be orphaned, and then people would just have to upgrade their nodes and upgrade their mining nodes. Um, you can go on either side of that, depending. Like it's just basically a community decision. Ideally, since it's kind of like an issue that nobody would normally care about, they would all just pick a side instead of like having both exist perpetually. But like that kind of like weirdness has happened in the past. I don't have the code in front of me, but there was a quirk for, I think it was even check data sig. I think it was check data sig, or no, it was back when we were doing the Coinbase, not Coinbase, but the Segway Recovery code. So the specification for the Segway Recovery code didn't make it clear that you literally don't run the script anymore. So the Segway Recovery, by the way, was historic. Like it was basically just a nicety that Bitcoin Cash was doing for people who had BCH locked up in a SegWit address, and then that became unspendable because of a previous hard fork rule that we implemented. And basically, like people made a mistake and then they like, effectively burned their BCH, but it was an accident. It wasn't that they burned it; they just couldn't spend it anymore. So this was a mechanism to allow miners to facilitate the recovery of those coins for people who um, didn't necessarily do anything wrong. They just happened to like be in this weird state in between upgrades where they had coins that were spendable for like weird reasons, but they're still spendable, and then all of a sudden have them not be spendable because of a malleability rule that we were trying to get rid of. So the SegWit recovery rule was basically, let's have us allow if the output is locked up in what looks like a SegWit script, then allow it to happen. Like just allow it to be spendable, but only by a miner. And and the specification was just like, okay, well, if that happens, then ignore the new rule that we put into place, the previous fork, like the clean stack rule is I think what it was. And instead of that actually happening in the code, what was actually happening is the script just never ran, which is fine because like the SegWit scripts on BCH are just like anyone can spend them anyway. Like there's no vulnerability there. But technically, then you could have had a potential fork where somebody would have tried to spend a invalid SegWit script just because it looked like a SegWit script. And then that would have been an interesting fork, right? Because like there's kind of like an interesting fundamental difference for like, well, what did we intend? Did we intend for the script to not be run, or did we intend for like just to help people recover their coins? So there's a little bit of like fundamental differences, but fortunately, I think Mark actually found that out like well before the actual upgrade date. But then like I think BCHD both had to like go in and update our code to no longer like to just straight up not run the script anymore. And that's just a good example of the code being spec is not a great idea. like like you can't just say this is the spec, and just because Bitcoin ABC implemented it this way in code doesn't mean that that's how it should be. It should actually be, well, this is what the spec says. This is what everybody agreed to do. Let's follow the actual specification in the BIP instead of the code. So there's lots of subtle differences like that can happen, and they can cause forks unintentionally. And they it's not the end of the world, and that's also why like node diversity is really beneficial because you can decide after the fact what you want to follow. Instead of basically having a bug in the protocol become a part of the protocol because you have no other options. So yeah, a specification can help with those kinds of things because it gives people, it forces people to be, or it incentivizes people to be a little bit more clear and intentional for what they're doing, instead of just saying, well, this is what the code does, so therefore that must be what's right, because it may not actually be right.
And I'm sure some of the clearness and the intention that comes with it, it can't be avoided if you're forced to put it in written language, right?
Yeah, I mean, like words. I mean, it's a difficult problem, right? Because words aren't always perfect. You know what I mean? Like, you just because you say it should do X doesn't necessarily like code is very precise in not always a good way, but it's very precise. Like what I don't think people that aren't programmers realize is when you are writing code, you're not like the computer doesn't think for itself. Like you're literally telling it to do every single little operation. And for those reasons it's very concise, but they may not be what you're telling it to do may not be what you necessarily want it to be doing. So it's deterministic in the sense that it's going to do what you tell it to do, but you're also telling it more in programming code than you would be in English. So like for instance, let's take just a simple rule of like adding two numbers together, right? Let's say a new script opcode is like, add 4 to a variable in a script. It's simple, like just literally add 4 to the thing. Well, okay, our specification in words should be when this opcode happens, you take the top item on the stack and then you increment it by 4. And then that value gets put back on the stack. Okay, like that's fairly concise. But what happens if that number is 3 less than the max number that could be on the stack? What happens then? Well, we don't know. Like, depends how you write the code. If you write the code, it might roll over. It might not work. It might throw an exception. Like, all sorts of stuff happens. So, like, there's a lot more conversation that can happen, that needs to happen in the word specification, than normally happens when we just describe what we're trying to do. So, writing the verbal spec is honestly very hard because there's lots of edge cases like that can happen, a lot of unintended consequences, and it's not a perfect world, but it's better than just saying, oh well, what happens if it's 3 less than the max value? Well, we'll have the specification be whatever OpenSSL decides to do in that particular case, and we don't know because we didn't write OpenSSL. You know what I mean? Like that's not the world we should live in a professional like distributed peer-to-peer cache network. Like we should be trying to be as intentional as we can be.
Sure, and given any shortcomings, it still sounds like a huge step forward, but
Yeah.
also a big job. So, how did you end up deciding to take this on?
Um, so Bitcoin Unlimited and some people from Bitcoin Unlimited put up a BUIP. I don't remember when. It was like in February of, I think, maybe 2 years ago. It was basically before we went to Australia for the Bitcoin Cash conference in Australia. And for me, that was actually the first time that I've met a lot of the Bitcoin Cash developers in person. It was a really great event for me. I really enjoyed attending. But while I was there, we were talking, and uh, unbeknownst to me, I was getting secretly like grilled for whether or not like I actually knew what was happening in the protocol, and apparently I secretly passed some of those tests. And they were like, well, okay, we need someone to write this specification, and who would be a good person to do that? And apparently, I think like Emergent Reasons and John Silverblood were like, well, Josh Green could probably do that because he's written the full node from scratch and he's had to go through a lot of the pain that a lot of the node implementators don't have to do because we inherited the code base from BTC, right? So a lot of the subtle rules, I think everyone's fairly cognizant of, but they didn't actually have to write. Versus our path was like implementing something and then feeling the pain of having to realize what the documentation says isn't actually what's happening, and then going in and figuring out why. So they asked me if I wanted to take that on, and I think my first answer or my first question was, "Is it paid?" And then they said it was. So then I said, "Okay, like I think that could be good. I think that could actually be very valuable for the network, especially because it was incredibly relevant to me. Like the process of having to reverse engineer the code is something that was very painful to do, very very tedious to do." And I am also in favor of having multiple node implementations. So it's a huge barrier of entry to say, okay, you want to write a node implementation? Well, first you have to figure out how the nodes work on your own by reverse engineering other people's code. And like that's, people aren't going to do that unless you're crazy like me, apparently. Like it's not a good thing for you to be doing, and it's also a really good way for you to miss things. Like there's a lot of nuanced like gotchas in the Bitcoin protocol that we don't necessarily want people to be guessing at. We want to document it, say that this is what happens, and then be able to recall it when we're looking at new opcodes and we're looking at new furthering the protocol. We don't want to forget that this weird edge case happens, and the only reason that only two people know about it because they happen to be around when it was written 10 years ago and even further in the future. Like what happens when I'm old and older and no longer working on Bitcoin, and Bitcoin Cash still exists, and new developers come in, like new blood, and they have no documentation about what historically has happened. Um, like they're going to have to go through even more years of code to figure out what the edge cases are. Like that's just not sustainable. So it's almost like a necessary mission for the longevity of Bitcoin Cash to have the specification.
Sure, and I guess it's almost ironic that the person who had to, or the team that had to do so much work to get their node written in a new programming language up and running is also the one best positioned to do more work in laying down the specification, huh?
I mean, yeah, it's. I would like to say that it's completely fresh in my mind and that I have a perfect memory and therefore haven't forgotten all of the quirks that exist, but that's not true, right? Like, there's a lot of quirks where it's just like, oh yeah, that happens. I forgot about that. But I think honestly, I don't regret being a little bit cynical when I was writing a lot of the codes for Bitcoin Verde. There's a lot of comments being like, apparently this happens and no one told me. And I figured it out by looking at this obscure blog post and then this line of code in this file in a completely different project. So like the code within Bitcoin Verde, whenever I found one of those weird things, I usually documented it either in the code or as a separate file, which has been very valuable to writing the specification itself. And also, um, the way that we structured the code is, by we I mean, so it's not just me that's working on the specification, right? It's actually Andrew Groot. I mean, also it's a community effort, so like literally anybody can uh, add content to the specification. Like it's meant to be that way. It's not meant to be something that I own, or even Bitcoin Verde owns. It's literally a community asset. It's, Creative Commons license for a reason. Like, take it and modify it, do whatever you want with it. Host your own version is actually one of the other things that we're trying to encourage people to do. Like, we don't want the specification to be seen as, oh, this is Bitcoin Verde's interpretation of what the specification, and now Bitcoin Verde gets to determine what the behavior should be. Like, that's literally the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. So, Bitcoin Unlimited has their own instance of the specification hosted. Bitcoin Verde does, and then we also have
Well,
John
if I may interrupt,
Silverblood.
where can
Yeah.
people find those?
Oh, that's great. My favorite one cosmetically is Jonathan Silverblood's copy, which is, I think, documentation.cash. I think that's pretty much his. Then there's reference.cash, which is Bitcoin Unlimited's. And then ours is Bitcoin Protocol.cash. And those are like the rendered versions of them. And then we have all of the files are backed up, or not backed up, but like what we're actually writing when we're writing the specification is actually a bunch of markdown files, so like .md files. And those are hosted in a GitHub repo. So those are all under version control. You can clone the repo. You can actually read the MD files directly without having to go to those websites. So if you wanted to look at the markdown yourself, which, I mean, GitHub actually does a fairly good job of supporting natively because it renders the markdown files. You could just go directly to github.com/softwareverde/ I think it's Bitcoin Cash specification with hyphens.git. And then Bitcoin Unlimited has one as well, but I forget what their link is. So lots of people can fork it, and actually that's one way for people to make changes is by literally just forking the repo, modifying the changes that they're modifying the files that they want to change, and then making a pull request.
And that's probably going to be the most standard way that it happens, is by presenting a pull request to your guys' repo and then possibly maintaining their own.
It's actually completely personal preference. So the other way that we so for instance, Bitcoin Protocol.cache is meant to be more like a wiki. It's still like what you write is still markdown and it still gets saved as a markdown, but it's more GUI element like oriented. And the intent behind that is for instance, say like I am a developer or a script developer or someone who's going through the specification and happen to find that the specification isn't accurate or is missing some small factoid of what's actually happening. It's a large barrier of entry to keep the specification up to date if I have to go find the Git repo, go clone it, then go find where it's stored, and then go update it, and then make a pull request, and then handle any like PR request modifications that happened because, whatever. Like, people will do it because it's important, but there's also a good reason to not do it because you have probably 500 other things going on at the time. So it might be one of those things where you're like, oh, I'll remember to change that later. And then you forget about it or you don't because you don't have time. So what we wanted to do instead is we wanted to have like a really quick and easy way for users to go in and say, okay, well, I'm going to click this paragraph like I would any other like wiki, and I'm going to make a small change, and then I'm going to save it and submit it, and then it's going to get like into some queue for acceptance later. And that's what we do at Bitcoin Protocol.cache. Is not everyone can sign up because we didn't want it to have the same problem that Wikipedia has, where like anybody can go in and be like, "Oh no, the block size is supposed to be 1 MB," and like like we didn't want people to go in and do that. So you kind of have to be, at least for that website, you have to be someone of some like notoriety, I suppose, in the community, and it's just because it's our version. If you don't like that, then just clone it, like, and then run your own. That's also an option. So yeah, but yeah, we didn't want to. We wanted to make the barrier of entry for people to use this pretty painless because ultimately, like, we're going to be using this for years to come. because as the specification grows over time, keeping it up to date is going to be its own, um, you know, task. It's not something that you do once and then forget about. It's always going to be evolving with every change and every new discovery.
Sure, and you've sort of already been touching on this throughout the conversation, but just curious if there's anything else that makes writing specifications difficult. What are the challenges generally? I mean, you've mentioned having to even put it in words can be difficult in the first place. Deciding who gets to maintain it is something you've already sort of addressed, but is not easy. What else goes into this?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the most difficult part that I have personally is the fact that I take for granted what I already know. Right. If I'm trying to explain how something works, to a brand new person, it's hard for me to remember that they may not know what a script is, right? Like we were talking about script earlier and what a max value is on the stack. And like, if you aren't familiar already with what the Bitcoin scripting language is, like that whole conversation didn't make any sense. Um, and remembering that you have to really call out everything is something that is really easy to make the mistake of. And that's also very tedious, but for a good cause. So we want to make sure that we're covering not just the interesting new parts, but also the historical things that for the knowledge that people are currently taking for granted. One way that we've found is really great to mitigate that is actually we had the opportunity to hire an intern a month ago, and Chris, and we hired Chris, I was like, well, what do you think about, like, how much do you know about cryptocurrencies? He's like, no, nothing. I'm like, okay, good, off to a good start. How much do you know about like blockchains? He's like, probably I know what they are, and that's about it. And like, okay, do you know how they work? And he's like, no. And basically, like, Chris is someone who's very intelligent and is a programmer, but hasn't gone through the uh, you know trial of hard knocks, school of hard knocks to learn what how crypto, like how Bitcoin Cash works. So he's a fresh mind who can understand programming, and then we can say, okay, well, read the specification and then tell us what questions you have, and try to answer them either through the specification or through conversation. And then when you feel like you do understand it, write it down. And then what we'll do is we actually have him reviewing a lot of like the super simpler things, and I mean he does some of the complicated things too. He actually just I think started mempool last week, but it's such a great idea to have someone with a brand new perspective write things and ask questions, because we're like, oh yeah, we totally didn't explain this whole concept. Like, you don't know what an SPV node is versus what a full node is, and we didn't call that out. Maybe we should. So it's a really great like sanity check to be reminded that there is so much knowledge in the developers' brains that we take for granted that we still have to make sure that we're explaining. So that's been a really like difficult but fun challenge, to be perfectly honest. It's really kind of fun to see all the things that we forget that we know.
Sure, and I'm familiar generally with what end up either being funny or horror stories, but of people getting products, say, in front of users for the first time and seeing the surprising but still totally understandable ways that they completely misinterpret or misuse or misunderstand what the intent was, and I'm sure it can only be uh, as bad with when it comes to a specification.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't think we've had anything like terribly like, oh, you totally misunderstood that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think we've had anything like super bad, but like, there's been plenty of content where it's just like that doesn't make any sense, and I'm like, okay, it's probably because there's a whole another page of background knowledge that you need in order for it to make any sense. But yeah, like having we actually as a software company like really like rely on rapid feedback, like trying to get something in front of the users as fast as possible because they're going to see things that we just don't. It's the same mentality for the specification too, right? Like the fact that people like Jonathan Silverblood, who like he's just like, I'm using this currently, because I'm writing a script and I don't remember like what this opcode does, or I
Using
don't
it, you mean
remember
the specification?
the specification. And then I think at some point he was like, oh, like we didn't cover, this particular part, and then he went and documented it, and like that's great. And I think he actually made some issues on our GitHub too, of like this needs to be covered at some point. We need to document what this is because I'm not sure how it works and it's not covered in the specification. And like having people try to reference it is, in my opinion, just as valuable as having a user try to use your software for the first time and call out, okay, well, this doesn't work, or you're missing this feature, or like, wow, this really could be better if we did this differently. um, Getting that feedback early is really important, and it's just interesting that our users of the specification are other developers.
Right.
um, so it's kind of cool.
Absolutely. So there are holes, as you said, and rooms, places for improvement. But just given the general picture, of what you intend to include and what has been written, how far along is the spec?
Oh man.
Yeah.
I can tell you from a number of hours that we're contracted to do, versus like how many we've actually done. I would say we're probably like 60% of the way there, from an hours perspective. From a content perspective, I mean, like, I don't think it's never going to be done, right? It's never ever going to be fully done. And that's not to say that it's not going to be usable. It's just like there's always going to be something that can be elaborated a little bit better, or there's always going to be some minutia that even maybe talked about somewhere, but is hard to access, right? Making sure that we're structuring this in a way that you can actually find the information that we write is also a challenge, and that can always be improved. Um, so I mean, like, and also as we change the protocol too, we're going to have to update the new stuff and then also amend the stuff that changed from any updates to the protocol itself. So it's definitely a living document that needs to be, maintained over time, and needs to have, um, it needs to be taken care of. But as far as getting it to a state where it's actually valuable to people to use, I think we're there. Like it right now, you can, like, especially if you're a script developer, right? Like go into the opcode. Like if you're like me, you're not going to literally remember the details of every opcode that exists. Like I couldn't even probably name more than like 7 off the top of my head. And that kind of stuff is your bread and butter when you're writing Bitcoin, especially custom contracts, right? Like you need to know what options you have available to you. You need to know when, if they're enabled, you need to know, like, do they just take the item off the stack and then keep it gone, or do they put it back, like those kinds of things. And also, what are the orders for these things? So like using it as that kind of reference for like mid development is really nice. It's kind of like I don't know how much of the audience like programs C++, but like if you, or even any language really, like if you forget like what the API is, you're constantly going back to like the C++, like, spec, and being like, okay, well, what was the order for parameters for malloc, and like those kinds of things. And it's kind of the same way. Like right now, you could just reference the specification and say, okay, well, I'm fairly confident this is how it's going to behave. And at that point, it's already pretty usable. So depending on what components that you're actively working on, you're going to get more mileage. Like for instance, I think I are just starting the mempool, right? So if you're trying to look at what the consequences are of the transaction chaining limit for the mempool, like it's not going to be there. So from that perspective, like that's not going to help you. But if you have some extra time, go ahead and document what you know, and or just wait a couple weeks and then we'll publish the new version, and that'll help hopefully have that. So yeah, I mean, like, it's at least far enough along that it's valuable
And that's an
already.
important distinction, isn't it? That
Yeah.
The spec has obviously sections, and so some things are finished or are currently in a valuable state, and some things aren't. But it may very well be the case that what a developer needs is already there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And so, what do you think, or what effect do you think having a specification will have on the BCH development environment and maybe the network in general?
Yeah, I think it's going to be like, I mean, I hate to use like the kind of cliche phrase, but it's like a force multiplier. Like it is, because like if we're in a dev meeting and we wanted to, like, if we were actually debating a part of the protocol, so like again, the transaction chaining limit, right? Like unconfirmed transaction chaining. Like if we were having like a internal conversation of like, well, what are the consequences if we do X, Y, or Z? Well, one of the things we might do is go back to the specification and be like, okay, well, what are like the subtleties that we're forgetting about? Like, what are the things that we remembered are weird and complicated, but they're weird and complicated for a particular reason? So being able to go back and like see that and be reminded without having to rely on pretending like your memory is perfect is going to be very valuable. So it's going to make those changes a lot more like it's going to be easier to make those changes, and it's also going to be able to be better informed about making those decisions.
Very good. Well, before we wrap up, maybe it's also something you mentioned briefly earlier, but could you just let us know, who all has been working on it? So who are the guys at Bitcoin Verde that have been putting time on this and elsewhere?
Yeah. I mean, we have a contributors link in the specification itself. So if I definitely recommend people to go to check that out, and actually appreciate everyone's contributions there. From a Software Verde or Bitcoin Verde perspective, it's me, Andrew Groot, who is like a really good friend of mine. He also helped me like found the company like in 2011, a long time ago. Um, he's been working on Bitcoin Verde and also the specification. He is another example of somebody who didn't necessarily know Bitcoin Cash when I asked him to work on the specification, and it helps because not necessarily knowing everything ahead of time is a great way for you to be questioning. Well, like, does this really make sense? And how can I explain this in a way that someone who isn't omnipotent about the protocol can um, understand it. So Chris is also our new intern. He's been working on it. He hasn't published anything yet because we want to be very particular about like reviewing what he writes. But he's written a bunch of content so far. And then obviously Jonathan Silverblood from Bitcoin Unlimited. Andrew Stone is a huge person in this. Like Andrew Stone actually wrote, like, I think like he actually like did the first stab at the spec. Like he wrote a bunch of content in the very beginning. Since then we've kind of like blown up the structure. Like we like the first instance of the specification writing was like, okay, well, there's some content here already, but let's put it in a organizational structure that is scalable and that people can like find what they're looking for, and also be semi-intuitive for if you're writing the content, you can know where to go, and you can keep track of what still needs to be done. But he had wrote a bunch of content to begin with, and I know he's still working on some now. Um, I'm sure there are more, and I'm sorry for forgetting. But yeah, I definitely recommend checking out the contributors.md file.
Well, our thanks definitely go out to everyone who's working on this, and it's great to see that the work itself is being done. Josh, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to me about the Bitcoin Cash specification.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
And to our listeners and viewers, thanks very much for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube and hit that bell icon to be notified of new uploads from Bitcoin Unlimited.